director of the Humanist Center of Minnesota. There, he and a group of researchers from 2 universities are studying the beliefs, practices, and community involvement of those who are religiously unaffiliated. He was also the founding executive director of the Yale Humanist Community, where he worked as a humanist chaplain. He's currently a fellow at Augsburg University. Chris has also appeared on many major news channels and spoken at hundreds of conferences and universities. In addition to many magazine articles, he's written a book called Faitheist, How an Atheist Found Ground with the Religious. Copies of that are today available for purchase, and I imagine you can talk Chris into signing one. Chris and I share that we both graduated from Meadville Lombard Theological School, which is connected with the University of Chicago, and I was pleased to see that we also both received in our different years the Billings Prize. I eagerly await his finishing his next book, which is titled IRL, about the search for meaning, realness, and belonging in the digital age. It's my pleasure to introduce Chris Stedman to you today.
Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
You'll have to forgive me, I'm getting over my somehow second cold in the course of a month. It may be that winter has come a little early to Minnesota. It may also be that I am a month out from my deadline for this next book. Sure. But hopefully my voice, I think it's improved a lot. Hopefully it sounds okay. So thank you so much. I'm so glad that after all these years we were finally able to make this happen. I very much appreciate your patience. It is funny that I live much further away now, but I'm here than when I lived closer. And I also want to thank all of you for being here this morning and for being willing to spend part of your day with me. I'm really grateful to be here, not just to share some thoughts with you, though I'm excited to do that, but also to learn from you and from the wonderful work that I already know is happening in this space. So, I'm here to talk about the importance of and value of interfaith work. And it's a question that I've gotten many times over the years. Why would an atheist like myself, someone who doesn't believe in God, who also considers myself to be non-religious, be involved in interfaith efforts, which are sort of inherently about bringing together people of different faiths so that they can better understand each other? Now, I have a short answer to that question, and I have a longer answer. And given what I understand about attention spans, I'm going to start with the shorter answer. Well, hopefully you're still here with me. I mean, if I've lost you already, that's a problem. And so that shorter answer is this. By definition, interfaith work is work that's designed to bring together people who have different religious identities so that they can better understand each other, build solidarity, identify areas of shared concern, and then work together for the common good. Now, this work surely includes the voices of people who are religious. It's sort of implied in the word interfaith. But I believe that it must also include the voices of people who fall outside of sort of traditional religious categories, people who are non-religious or who are religious in non-traditional ways. If in fact the goal is to foster greater understanding across lines of difference, because one of those lines, one of the more contentious lines sometimes, is between those who consider themselves religious and those who do not. Now, in my experience, one of the best ways to begin transcending those lines is through the sharing of personal stories, because it gives you a window into the experience of someone who might have lived a very different life than you have, and helps you understand where they're coming from, what they've experienced, and it grounds the conversation not in an initial sort of disagreement over beliefs that we might not share, but rather an opportunity to empathize with someone else's experience. So if it's okay with you, I'm going to start by sharing a little bit of my own as a way to enter the conversation. So I grew up in Minnesota, the land of lutefisk, which my family does eat every year in December, and Lutherans. If you want to hear more about what the experience of eating lutefisk is like, I'm happy to tell you later. I don't want to subject unwilling participants to that. But though we were surrounded by Lutherans, we ourselves were not religious. In fact, I would say a more accurate way to describe my childhood would be that it was irreligious. We weren't religious, but we didn't really talk about it. I never heard the word God in my household growing up, but I never heard the word atheist either. We just weren't, and it wasn't really something we discussed. Which means I didn't really understand religion growing up. I knew other people were religious, but I didn't fully understand what that meant. I too had a very good friend as a child who was Jewish, and that was sort of my first exposure to religion. She invited me over to join her family for meals, and it was interesting to me, and I felt like I learned that she was part of this larger story and this larger community, but I was also in 3rd grade, and so it didn't really hold my curiosity all that long. I did have one sort of personal religious experience when I was a child, which is that I was baptized shortly after I was born. I don't remember it, but I've been told it happened. But it was really just an excuse to get the family together and celebrate the arrival of a new child. It wasn't an event with a whole lot of theological significance. And the reason I know that that's true is I was only ever told one story about my baptism growing up, and that is that when the minister was quoting scripture, was quoting Jesus saying, "Let the little children come unto me," my sister, who was a little older, took it as a call, an invitation, and ran right up to the front of the church and lifted up the minister's robes for the entire congregation. And I don't think that was the reason why, but we didn't go back to church again after that. But when that all changed when I was around 11 years old, and I became a born-again Christian. And looking back on my conversion at 11, I think there were kind of 2 primary factors that set the stage for that to happen. The first was that about a year prior to converting, I had started reading books like Alex Haley's Roots, Anne Frank's Diary of a Young Girl, John Hershey's Hiroshima, right? So I was reading these books that detailed some of the greatest atrocities in human history. And not only did they sort of increase my awareness of some of these events, but they told the stories of what it was like for people to experience those things in a way that filled me with a profound desire to understand what it meant that I was living in a world where people could be so inhumane to one another. What was my responsibility to the world around me? Why do people do such inhumane, cruel things to each other? Of course, I was 11, so I wasn't articulating it exactly like that, but that was part of the problem. I felt like I didn't even have the language to articulate these questions that I was thinking about. And I felt like I was learning about the things I was reading about in these events, in these books in school, but really just as sort of historical facts and not as these moral questions that the events that cause us, that hold up a mirror to us and cause us to look inward and ask ourselves, what is my responsibility in the face of injustice? And so when I was invited to this church by some friends, I suddenly found a space that was all about that oriented itself around trying to make sense of the things that don't make sense in life, trying to wrestle with what our responsibility is to the world around us. And then the second factor was a little bit more practical, which is that right around the time of my conversion, my parents were divorcing, and because we weren't involved in a religious community, my family really was the place where I went to find a sense of identity, a sense of belonging, a sense of community. And when that was disrupted, I was suddenly looking for community, for belonging, for a place to ground myself. And I found it in this community. So it was very quickly meeting these sort of 2 important needs that I had, the need to belong and the need for meaning, to make sense of my life, and to determine what my responsibility was to the world around me. But shortly after converting, a third thing happened, which was that I was also finally able to put language on something else, which was my recognition that I was queer. And so this presented a real sort of quandary for me, because on the one hand, this church was meeting really important needs that I had, and on the other hand, this church was incredibly theologically conservative and really fixated on sexuality in particular and on demonizing LGBTQ people. And so this sort of big irony of my conversion was that I had become a Christian because I was looking for a sense of belonging, and I was looking for a way to make sense of suffering and injustice. And instead, I really retreated within myself, and my own personal suffering increased really significantly. And so for a few years, I really struggled with this privately. But a few years into this struggle, something happened, something that at the time I was not thrilled about, but in hindsight I'm very grateful for, which is that my mother found a journal that I was keeping at the time where I was writing about what I was struggling with. today I suppose she would have, I don't know, hacked my phone or something, and found my secret Tumblr or something. And she read it, and my mother was not religious, and so she didn't really know how to really even talk to me about what I was struggling with. It felt like something she couldn't really walk with me through. But she did something really amazing, something that changed my life forever, which was that she went to the phone book. Again, something that wouldn't happen today for many people. But she went to the phone book, and because we were in the land of Lutherans, she called up churches and ended up reaching a Lutheran church, and found a minister who was LGBT affirming, and took me to speak with him the next day. And that moment really changed my life for a big reason, which was that he didn't tell me what to think. He didn't say, what you've been told is wrong, you should think this. He said, what you've been told is one way that people look at this. There are other ways that people look at this. And he directed me toward books, resources, and he told me that I could make up my own mind about what I thought about this. Of course, he told me also that I was fine as I was. He made me feel affirmed. But he also didn't just replace one person telling me what to think with another. And so he sort of set me on the course into progressive faith communities, where I found what I had been looking for, a sense of belonging, a way to make sense of injustice and to act in the face of it. And as I began to come out in high school and struggle to find belonging there, I really had this sort of safe community that I could turn to. So by the time I finished high school and decided I wanted to go to college, I decided I wanted to study religion because the people who had really helped me as I tried to make sense of these things and navigated these challenges were people like that minister that my mother took me to speak with. And I thought perhaps I would want to help people in that way. So I went to a Lutheran college to study religion in Minnesota. And it was there at my Lutheran college, being taught by all Christian religion faculty, that I became an atheist. Some people might look at that as a failure of the institution, but I actually think it's because this Lutheran institution really does what they set out to do well, which is in these religion classes I was taking, I wasn't simply learning about religion, though I was, but I was also being constantly challenged to ask myself what I thought about these things. My Christian professors really pushed me to ask myself important, hard questions about why I believed the things I believed, and supported me as those questions led me to realize that I had become a Christian not because of the theological truth claims of Christianity, but rather because of the function, because I was looking for this place to belong and this way to make sense of injustice and respond to it. And in fact, now I'm back at that same university, helping them work on what it means to be a Lutheran institution that serves an increasingly religiously diverse student body. Though it was founded as a training school for white Lutheran missionaries, it now has, this year's incoming class at Augsburg was 70% students of color, and a very large percentage of those students are Muslim, because the neighborhood surrounding Augsburg is, that neighborhood itself has the highest population of Somalians anywhere in the world outside of the country of Somalia. And so the institution has changed really quickly, and they take very seriously the idea of serving students who come to these questions in different ways. And so I was very fortunate that I ended up studying where I did. But because, I had gone through this sort of journey of trying to find my way into this faith community only to sort of end up out of it, I wasn't sure what to do with religion anymore at that point. The model that I saw for religious difference was the model that we see on some of the cable news channels that I have appeared on, like Fox News, for example, where people really just talk past each other instead of listening to one another. And so, given that the model of religious discourse that I saw was one of conflict, one of disagreement, one of going straight to the hardest point of difference, I didn't know what to do with the fact that I was an atheist studying religion at a Lutheran college surrounded by Lutherans. And so I would kind of alternate between sort of arguing with my religious classmates. I really enjoyed that. I grew up with 3 siblings very close in age, so I grew up loving to argue, or just avoiding the conversation, figuring if it was only going to ultimately lead to an argument, sometimes just maybe better to not talk about it. So I had experiences like we heard earlier where you just don't talk with people who are have a different religious identity than you do about it. And I also had experiences where we went right to the point of hardest disagreement. And so I was deeply conflicted about religion. I didn't really know how to navigate religious difference well, because I lived in this world that seemed to be defined by either or. And these conflicted feelings spilled outside of the classroom as well. And I found it really hard to talk about religion without arguing with people or avoiding. And so as a result, I ended up really struggling to connect with people who didn't share my beliefs. And one example of how this manifested was that every week I was working just down the street from my school at a community center that primarily served recent immigrants from Somalia. And I worked there constantly, and so I got to know people I was working with very closely. And much like one of the comments we had, it was I, previous to that experience, really hadn't had much interaction with people who identified as Muslims at all, and certainly hadn't had any kind of meaningful conversations about what they believe. And I also, frankly, had quite a bit of assumptions about what they might believe. And I thought we would definitely disagree on some things, and so I decided, while I was there, to just avoid the conversation, that we just weren't going to talk about religion at all. And so, I would show up, and anytime there was something related to religion that came up, I would find some way to sort of change the subject. But one day I was staying late and talking with a woman who I'd worked with a number of times there, and at one point in our conversation, really sort of unexpectedly, she began to confide in me that she was afraid quite a bit when walking around our neighborhood because she wore a hijab, she wore a head covering, and she had experienced really horrific street harassment because of this, people profiling her. She had told me about horrible names that people called her, that things people had shouted at her, violence she'd experienced, people who had thrown rocks at her. And as I listened to her talk about this, I found myself feeling deeply angry on her behalf, upset. I found myself feeling like I had been so ignorant. I had no idea that this was something that she would experience. It was so invisible to me, her reality. I had no idea that she would experience that kind of thing. But I also found myself, though our experiences were hugely different, identifying with some of the emotional experience she was describing, some of the fear, some of the anxiety, because I too had experienced street harassment walking around our neighborhood. I too had had people shout really horrific, homophobic things at me. I too had experienced violence in our neighborhood. I too had been physically assaulted by strangers in a homophobic attack. And so again, even though our experiences were profoundly different, there on a level I understood how she was feeling because I had felt it too. And so as that sort of wall that I had up came down, I told her this. I told her that I was upset and angry to hear that this had happened to her, but that also, even though our experiences were different, I could identify in some ways with what she was saying because I had experienced violence and harassment around being queer. And as soon as I said this, I felt immediately just nauseous, like I was going to throw up, because I realized I had just outed myself for the first time to anyone at the center. I really hadn't told anyone there, certainly that some may have guessed, but I hadn't told anyone that I was queer, and I certainly hadn't told anyone there that I was an atheist. In fact, I would look now and I realized I told people very little about myself at all, because I had this sort of don't ask, don't tell policy. And so I had shared very little of my life or experiences with them. And I had some assumptions, and so I wasn't sure what the response was going to be. But she responded in a way that really surprised me. She responded in a way that was very different from the kinds of arguments or avoidance conversations I was having around religion, which was that she didn't really comment on what I had said at all, but instead asked a question. She asked me, so what is it that you do in those moments when you feel afraid? She said, for me, it's my faith. I turn to my faith. I believe God is watching over me and protecting me, and that's what gives me that resolve in that moment that helps me go on. But I realized, I don't know what it is that you believe, and so I'm just curious, what is it for you? What's your source of strength in those moments? And this kind of response was, it caught me totally off guard, because instead of going straight to the point of hardest disagreement, instead of going straight into an argument or getting uncomfortable and changing the subject, she invited me into a very different kind of conversation about difference. One that was about an invitation to share not only my experiences, but how I make sense of them, to enter into a kind of exchange where I could learn more from her experiences as well, an opening instead of a closing. But because I felt so unprepared to navigate those kinds of conversations, because I wasn't sure how to do it, I made up some excuse about having a paper that was due the next day, and I left. I wasn't able to go there. But as time went on, years later, I began to look back on that experience and others like it and see them as missed opportunities. Opportunities not only for me to learn about religion as someone who's studying it in a classroom setting, but to learn about it as a lived experience, but also for me to personally grow and be challenged. The part of why I fled that day wasn't just because I was uncomfortable with having those kinds of conversations. It was also because I didn't really have an answer to her question. I had spent so much time thinking about what I didn't agree with in other people's beliefs, and very little time thinking about what I actually did believe in. So when she asked me what my source of strength was, part of my avoidance of that conversation and others like it was I didn't really have a whole lot to bring to the table. And so as time went on, I started to look back at that and wonder what would happen if we had more of those different kinds of conversations about religious difference. So I went back to school at UW in Chicago, and at the same time I started working for an organization in Chicago called Interfaith. And it was those two experiences that put me in touch with so many religious people. It gave me the opportunity to work in a missionary Baptist church for a year, to work alongside people of faith in all kinds of different interfaith settings, working for social justice. And it was in those settings that I really found myself feeling like, I wonder what is out there for me in terms of community as someone who is a non-theist and non-religious. And I even started to wonder, as I saw the value of these conversations, these interfaith conversations, and an opportunity for non-religious people like me to learn and grow, and also to teach and share. I also began to recognize that so many of the religious people in these conversations were coming into them because they had a community of their own that helped sort of bring them to the table and helped them feel prepared to talk about what they thought. And I started to wonder if non-religious people like me had community spaces where we could engage in that way, if it would be easier to enter into these kinds of conversations. And sure enough, I read a book around that time called American Grace by Robert Putnam and David Campbell. It reports on an extensive study on the lives of religious Americans. And one of the things they found in their research is that religious people in the United States are much more civically engaged than non-religious people are, meaning they give more of their money to charity, both religious and secular charities. They volunteer their time in their communities more. They vote at much higher levels. Evangelical Christians vote, have a voter registration rate that's 3 times higher than the religiously unaffiliated do. In all these different ways, religious people in the United States are more involved in their broader communities, not just their religious communities, than non-religious people are. And Putnam and Campbell say, as a result of this finding, that religious people in the US are better neighbors than the non-religious are. But they found something that complicates that finding, something that I think is really important, which is they found that a non-believing spouse who was involved in their believing spouse's religious community was just as civically engaged as the believing spouse was. And so because of this, they suggest that the correlation between being religious and being a good neighbor has less to do with belief and more to do with belonging, with being a part of a community that holds you accountable to your beliefs, that challenges you to think about how you're living in the world, what your response is in the face of injustice, that makes you feel accepted, welcomed, connected, and that gives you a way of thinking about how you identify and how you move through the world so that you can enter into conversations with people who have other ways of identifying. And they actually go so far as to suggest that morally oriented communities for non-religious people could help play a similar role in helping non-religious people be more involved in their broader communities. And so that's what sort of set me on the course to do the community organizing and chaplaincy work that I've done for the better part of a decade now. I moved out to Harvard, took a position serving the non-religious and non-theistic students at Harvard as one of the humanist chaplains there, and then did the same at Yale for 4 years before moving back to Minnesota. And so now the current project I'm involved in there is I'm working with a number of local humanist groups, the Humanists of Minnesota, First Unitarian Society of Minneapolis, which is a historically humanist UU congregation, and others, to explore what it would look like to open a center for humanist life, specifically wanting to serve these religiously unaffiliated people, which are that's the fastest growing segment of the religious landscape right now, with a fourth of all Americans and a third of people under the age of 30 now saying that they are not religious. But what we're doing is I've been working with a researcher at the University of Minnesota and a researcher at UMass Boston to build a survey to specifically study non-religious people in community. What does community mean to them? Where are they currently finding it? What do they expect out of community? And our hope is we'll be able to share these findings broadly because this is a really understudied sort of segment of the population. And my hope is it will help more non-religious people not just find community and belonging, but also plug into these kinds of interfaith exchanges. And part of why I've sort of taken this path of doing this humanist community building work and trying to advocate for interfaith dialogue that includes non-religious and non-theistic people is because I see my sense of self, my sense of identity as a humanist and a non-theist as being inextricably bound up in the identity and well-being of others. I can't simply worry about making sure that myself and my community are cared for, supported, without worrying about the well-being of others. Our joys and our challenges are intimately connected to one another. And the way that we begin to address the stigmas that we may have about other groups or that other groups may have about us is by not just getting together once and having a dialogue, but by entering into relationships with each other, relationships where we work together on shared challenges. Sure enough, there was a 2014 Pew poll that found that atheists are statistically tied with Muslims in the US for the most negatively viewed religious or ethical category. But there's encouraging news about that, which is that same Pew poll, the one that found that atheists are among the least positively viewed groups in this country, also found that people who said that they knew an atheist rated atheists a full 21 points higher than those who said that they didn't. And so it's a really dramatic difference. And it may seem common sense, but when people avoid the conversation about religion, when we're told that this is something we shouldn't talk about, and certainly that we should only talk about with people that we already know, who maybe share many of our views already, then it makes it really difficult to forge those relationships that we need to address those misunderstandings between groups. And this is what intentional interfaith dialogue is about, giving people those opportunities to connect and interact. But these relationships do more than just reduce suspicion and mistrust between communities. I have learned so much, like this great prompt that we had this morning, from people who don't share my worldview. They've taught me a great deal, not just about other ways of thinking about big questions, but also they force me to articulate what I believe in the context of a relationship where I can't just assume we're already on the same page. And so as an example of what these kinds of relationships can look like and what they can accomplish, I'd like to tell one last story about my friendship with a former minister of mine. So when I was in high school, I met a Lutheran pastor, of course, through a church program named Matthew. And he quickly became a pastor and a mentor to me. When I was accepted to a Lutheran college to study religion, I told him that he was a big part of the reason why that I wanted to major in religion, because of the example he had set for me. But we lost touch when I was in college as I became an atheist and kind of drifted away from some of the people I had met through church. But years later, when I moved out to Boston to begin working with the community at Harvard, I received an email from Matthew saying he had heard that I had just moved to Boston and he had as well, and asking if I wanted to get together. So we set a time to meet over coffee, and he began telling me about why he had moved. He had moved to work for this organization that worked to address systemic hunger among children, and so that his organization worked to raise the money for and package highly nutritious, low-cost meals for children experiencing food insecurity. But they were at that point only working with Christian churches and Christian events like conferences. So he was telling me about this, and as I listened to him, I just thought the timing was so funny because I had just had a meeting with members of the humanist community where we were talking about what issues do we think are really important that we really want to work on, and hunger was one that everyone kept saying they really wanted to work on hunger in our community. And so I just thought this was perfect timing, and so I decided to ask if you would be willing to branch outside of working with Christian communities and work with an atheist community on an interfaith initiative. And I was thrilled that he didn't hesitate. He said he would love to. But it's funny that he didn't hesitate, because when he first emailed me and asked to get together, I totally did. I had no idea what he wanted, but I found myself asking all these questions. You know, what will he think about the fact that I'm not only not a Christian anymore, but I'm a professional atheist? Will he feel like he failed me? Will he want to argue and debate? Is he going to want to try and sort of poke at what I believe now? Is this some sort of long con? Is he trying to kind of bring me back into the fold? I had all kinds of conspiracy theories about what it might have been. But I was thrilled because it turned out my hesitance was unmerited. He was totally interested in and overjoyed to see that I was doing the kind of work that I had initially set out to do, helping people make sense of their lives and find a sense of belonging. And he was thrilled for the opportunity for us to work together in this new way. And so I would say now, as a result of that conversation, he and I actually have a better and more honest relationship even than we did when I was younger. But it's also been a more productive relationship too. In the course of just a few years, we organized events in partnership with various faith communities around Boston to organize and raise the money for hundreds of thousands of meals for food insecure children, which is way more than our small humanist community could have done on our own. And so as I think about this friendship I have with him, my renewed relationship with my former pastor, it inspires me to wonder what the world would look like if we were more willing to sort of take that chance when we feel that hesitance to have that conversation, and to forge what may feel like unconventional alliances, which I know this community certainly does. You know, what would happen if we were more radical about whom we saw as our collaborators, if we took the risk of reaching out to those who seem unfamiliar and different, if people of all faiths and the non-religious started seeing one another as necessary partners in addressing our shared challenges, what might we come to better understand about one another in that process, in that work together? What might we come to better understand about ourselves in that work together? And what might we accomplish together that we couldn't on our own? Many of the most pressing issues that we face today as a planet, widespread disease, economic disparity, climate change, access to clean water, systemic racism, hunger, these issues don't care about our religious differences. They don't care about our designations of right and wrong, us and them. And in fighting these issues, neither should we. And our work opposing these common enemies can transform us into not only allies in the fight against fundamentalism, bigotry, but also friends, people who are in relationship with one another. More than 1 billion people on this planet don't have enough food, and that includes 1 in 6 Americans, which means this is a problem that will take more than just Christians, more than just atheists, more than just any member of any one group to solve this problem. My work with Matthew and other interfaith and hunger activists in Boston put a small dent in hunger, to be sure, but it was a start. It was a much larger dent than we could have on our own. I call that work service. My friend Matthew calls it ministry. Even though our words are different, our values and our work overlapped. And because we didn't let those different words get in the way, we were able to make that small dent much larger than we could have on our own. And to me, this is, I think, the most important thing about interfaith work, or the thing that I care about most. Because as an atheist and a humanist, I believe that it is up to us to build the world that we want to see. There are no, in my eyes, no divine forces of any kind that are going to influence human events. And so that means that our communities are going to have to find ways to work together. Thus, if I put my faith anywhere as an atheist, it is in the people around me, in the people here today. No pressure or anything, but you know, I put my faith in humanity, that we can find ways to live alongside one another and work together to address our shared challenges. We may not agree on whether or not there are any gods or other supernatural forces, but I do hope that we can agree that building a more just world in the here and now for all people, religious and non-religious alike, will require that we find ways not just to tolerate one another, not just to live alongside one another in peace, but to actively love one another, to care about one another. After all, in the words of the late astronomer, author, and agnostic Carl Sagan, for small creatures such as we, the vastness is bearable only through love. That is, for me, what makes life bearable, not just bearable, but joyful. I'm thrilled to be here with you today to learn from you and the work that you do, because that is how we make change, by loving one another, by caring about what happens to people, not just in our own category, but outside of our categories, to dismantle this narrative that our communities should remain siloed and separate. Because if you want, this is in the words of novelist and scholar Thomas King, if you want a different ethic, you have to tell a different story. It's not just about getting to know people who are different from you. It's pushing back against this broader cultural narrative that says that people who believe different things can't find areas of shared agreement and shouldn't find ways to work together. So we have to find ways to tell another story, and I think that begins by sharing our stories with one another. So if I can leave you with a challenge, one I'm sure many of you are already fulfilling, it is this. I want to challenge you to tell that different story, to reach out to people around you who you think probably don't share a lot of your beliefs, and try to find an entry point for the conversation. It's not always possible, to be sure, and it requires an assessment not only of your own willingness and ability, and there's many days when I'm not up for the challenge, but also there are many people who are not going to be open to hearing it from me ever. And so sometimes I'm not the right person. But part of what I get out of being involved in interfaith stuff is that I get to develop relationships with people who can go back into their communities and do that work for me, who their community may be more open to hearing from them than they would be from me. And so the story, when it comes to transforming broader cultural narratives, it starts on the grassroots, small level. So if I can challenge you to try to practice that in your daily life, this practice of telling a different story, I would like to invite you to do that. That would be great. Because when I think about what it means to tell a different story, I think about my sister, who is a Lutheran, and the kind of story that she told me when she asked me if I would be a godfather to her youngest child. I made some joke about being an atheist and maybe not qualified for that kind of role. But she responded in a way that was completely serious. She said, you being an atheist is not something we need to sort of wallpaper over or figure out or work around. It's part of why I asked you, honestly, because, I want my children to grow up knowing that there are people who have different beliefs than I do, that are good people, that care about the world. But I also want them to see that they can grow up to not share my beliefs, and they will still be a part of this family, and they will still be loved. And to me, that kind of story is just as important and just as true as the stories about people with different beliefs disagreeing with one another and being in conflict. In fact, I'd argue it's more important because it's the kind of story that doesn't get told nearly as often in our culture. It's the kind of story that gets ignored in favor of stories of disagreement and conflict and violence. But it's also the kind of story that can help us discern how to not only live alongside one another in peace, but also love